Breaking the wall of an algorithm-based society. How big platforms change the organization of society. David Stark, Columbia University. On November the 9th, 1989, I was in Ithaca, New York, where I was a visiting fellow at Cornell's Society for the Humanities.
Good afternoon. My name is David Stark. It's such a pleasure to talk with you today about my research. I want to tell you the topic specifically that I'll be talking about: algorithmic management in the platform economy. Research for this project was sponsored by a grant from the European Research Council. Let's start with a question. What are the 7 most valuable companies in the world today? 10 years ago, that list was headed by the petrochemical dinosaurs, ExxonMobil and PetroChina. By 2020, September, a decade later, they had been displaced by these 7 companies: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and the Chinese giants Tencent and the Alibaba Group. Now, platforms, all these companies have adopted the platform model, these 7 giants. Platforms are not only gigantic, they are also ubiquitous in our lives. We engage with platforms every day, very frequently. We use platforms, we go on platforms to see films, to order cars, to fund projects, to book travel, to buy and sell all kinds of products, to download music, to find a match. But in addition to the online service providers that we confront every day and encounter, it's also the case that some manufacturing firms are also adopting the platform model. And that's the case, for example, with the John Deere giant agricultural equipment manufacturer. So John Deere obviously makes agricultural equipment. And you see me here with James, a Nebraska farmer, his John Deere tractor and John Deere planter. Now, James's cabin of his tractor is air conditioned, but more importantly, the cabin has an onboard computer and an onboard GPS guidance system. And because of that, at some point, James can take his hands off the wheel and the tractor plants or harvests or fertilizes the field entirely by itself. Now, most importantly, while James is on the tractor, John Deere's platform is gathering data in real time and on a meter-by-meter basis of soil conditions and crop yields. So what's happening here? 2 things are happening. On one side, on his tractor, James is harvesting corn on the John Deere platform, because James subscribes to the John Deere platform. John Deere is harvesting data. What is the platform model? I want to argue that the platform model is the distinctive organizational form of the 21st century. Economic sociologists and political economists have identified 3 basic types of forms by which economic activity can be organized. One is markets, one is hierarchies, and the other is networks. So what do people do on markets? On markets, people compete. In bureaucratic hierarchies, some people command. And in the trust-based environments of network organizations collaborate. What do platforms do? Well, platforms may be seen as involving all three of these, but that doesn't really get to the point. Do platforms compete? Well, Silicon Valley entrepreneur Peter Thiel would tell us, exclaim, competition is for losers. And many platforms enjoy monopoly or near monopoly positions. So it might be much more appropriate for us to talk about platform monopoly capitalism. What about hierarchies? Well, if you thought about the distribution centers of Amazon, yes, these are rigidly, very, very heavily bureaucratic and hierarchical. But the distribution centers of Amazon are just one component of its activities. And Amazon does not command the buyers and sellers that operate on its platform. Now, network effects are very important for platforms, but platforms are not a trust-based environment. So what do platforms do? I want to argue that platforms are a distinctive form because they co-opt. Platforms co-opt assets, resources, and activities that are not part of the firm. And what do I mean by co-ops? Let's go back to James. James, as he harvests data for John Deere, is not employed by John Deere. He is not commanded to do. He is not supervised by John Deere. Yet John Deere co-ops the most important, valuable thing that he does, which is that he is gathering data. We very much do the same. When we're posting on Instagram or on Twitter, when we're liking something on Facebook, when we're valuing and rating our Uber driver, when we're rating songs or albums or films, all of this is producing data for which we are not paid or compensated or commanded, but which the platforms co-opt. So on one hand, we might think about platforms as being very flat. In some ways, they are. The whole idea of platform conveys that. But I think the more appropriate kind of topological figure would be that of the Mobius strip. You know, you take a ribbon, you put it together like this, and it has an inside and an outside, but you give it a twist and then you join it back. And a Mobius strip is that very interesting topological figure which has no inside or outside. And I want to argue that platforms are very similar. Things are happening on the platform, but not in the firm. And that poses a very distinctive managerial challenge. So if it is the case that the most valuable activity that's taking place, the most value-generating activity is taking place on the platform, but not in the firm, how do platforms manage and control that activity? Let's take a moment to give some historical perspective to this. In the opening decades of the 20th century, a new knowledge class emerged. And we can make an argument that the ideology of that new knowledge class was pioneered by Frederick Winslow Taylor, a mechanical engineer. In the first decades of the 21st century, another but different knowledge class is emerging. And it is pioneered by software engineers. Now, some people argue that there's a straight line between the scientific managers and the algorithmic managers, that algorithmic management is somehow an updating or perfecting even of scientific management. I disagree. I think they're very different. There is one way in which they are similar, however, because although both are highly technical, neither is scientific. Now, when we look back, we can see that, indeed, it's well the case that tailors step-by-step protocols to find the one best way could be seen as kind of like algorithmic methods. But I want to argue that Taylorism, scientific management, is very different from what is happening with algorithmic management. And first of all, because Taylorist scientific management was an ideology very much linked to the bureaucratic model. We know this bureaucratic model. The platform model looks different. It's not top-down, but genuinely three-sided. It has platform operators, providers, and consumers. And it's important that we understand that the providers and the consumers are not acting as the agents that are supervised by the platform. In fact, these relations in this three-sided relationship are not supervisory. So what's going on? There are transactions between providers and consumers. Consumers make ratings. Platform operators take these ratings and they turn them into rankings, which they make available to the consumers and the providers. But it doesn't stop there, because in these transactions, it can also happen that the providers are making ratings about the consumer, and so on, in a very interesting kind of cybernetic loop. But my diagram is inadequate. This is a very peculiar kind of cybernetic loop, quite different from the cybernetic control of Heinz von Förster, because these are not ordinary cybernetic loops. Each is twisted. So this would be a more important representation of what the platform is. The ratings and rankings that are circulating, or these ratings and rankings circulate through feedback loops that are twisted rather than circular. And so algorithmic management involves a very peculiar kind of cybernetic control. It's one in which, at each fold of the cybernetic loop, accountability can be discredited, deflected, and denied. Whether in the United States, or Germany, or Bolivia, Korea, India, anywhere in the world, the problems that are created by algorithmic management are a major challenge that our societies are facing today. Thank you.